Listen to this. During World War II, there was a secret American military unit that saved up to 30,000 Allied soldiers' lives. But here's the crazy part. They never fired a single shot. Instead, they used inflatable rubber tanks, pre-recorded sound effects, and fake radio chatter to completely trick the German army into thinking massive Allied forces were attacking in the wrong places. I'm talking about hundreds of German soldiers surrendering to equipment that wasn't even real. I'm talking about entire Nazi divisions being redirected away from actual Allied positions because they thought they were about to get destroyed by an army that literally didn't exist. And the wildest part? This entire operation was kept classified for over 40 years after the war ended. The men who pulled off some of the most brilliant deceptions in military history couldn't even tell their own families what they did. So how did a bunch of artists, sound engineers, and special effects experts end up becoming one of the most effective combat units in American military history? How did they pull off over 20 major battlefield deceptions without the Germans catching on? And why did the US government keep this secret for so long? By the end of this video, you're going to know exactly how this ghost army operated, the insane tactics they used, and the specific battles where their tricks literally changed the outcome of the war. Because what they did wasn't just clever, it was absolutely genius. But before we get into the actual operations, we need to understand something that most people get completely wrong about World War II. See, when most people think about World War II, they picture massive tank battles, huge infantry charges, and overwhelming firepower deciding who wins and who loses. And yeah, that stuff happened, but there was a much bigger problem that was killing Allied soldiers at an alarming rate. The problem was this. The Germans always seemed to know where the Allies were going to attack. Not sometimes, not occasionally, almost always. In 1943 and early 1944, Allied commanders were losing their minds, trying to figure out how German forces kept positioning themselves in exactly the right spots to counter Allied offensives. It was like the Germans had a crystal ball or something. The real issue was actually simpler than that, and way more deadly. Modern warfare requires massive concentrations of troops and equipment to punch through the enemy lines. You can't just sneak a few guys behind enemy lines and call it a day. You need tanks, artillery, supply trucks, thousands of soldiers, command posts, the whole 9 yards. And here's the problem with that. It's really hard to hide. German reconnaissance planes would fly over Allied positions. German scouts would watch troop movements. German radio operators would intercept communications. And piece by piece, the Germans would figure out exactly where the Allies were massing their forces for the next big attack. Then they'd simply move their own forces there and wait. The result? Thousands of Allied soldiers walking straight into prepared German defensive positions. Machine gun nests already set up, artillery already ranged in, mines already laid. It was a slaughter. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass in Tunisia in February 1943, American forces got absolutely destroyed. Over 6,000 American casualties in just a few days. Why? Because the Germans knew exactly where the Americans were and exactly what they were planning to do. The same thing kept happening in Italy. At Anzio in early 1944, Allied forces landed behind German lines thinking they'd catch the Germans by surprise. Instead, the Germans had rushed reinforcements to the exact spot and turned the whole thing into a 4-month nightmare that cost the Allies over 43,000 casualties. Allied commanders were desperate for a solution. They needed a way to hide their real troop movements while making the Germans think attacks were coming from completely different directions. Traditional camouflage wasn't cutting it. You can paint your tanks green and put nets over them, sure, but German reconnaissance planes flying at 20,000 feet with cameras could still count how many tanks you had and where they were positioned. Radio silence wasn't working either. Yeah, you could order your units not to use radios, but the sudden absence of radio traffic in one area while it picked up in another area told the Germans exactly what they needed to know. It was like a negative image revealing your plans. And here's what made it even worse. Time was running out. By spring of 1944, everyone knew the big invasion of France was coming. The question wasn't if, it was when and where. And if the Germans could figure out where the Allies were going to land, they could move their panzer divisions right to those beaches and turn D-Day into a complete disaster. The Allied command needed something new, something the Germans had never seen before, something so convincing that it would pull German divisions away from the real fighting and send them chasing ghosts. That's where the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops came in. But they weren't called the Ghost Army yet, and what they were about to do had never been attempted in the history of warfare. January 1944, Camp Forest, Tennessee. A bunch of soldiers were getting really confused. They'd been pulled from their regular units and told to report for a special assignment. Top secret stuff, really important. That's all they were told. When they showed up, they found something that made absolutely no sense for a military unit. There were professional artists, like actual artists from advertising agencies and design studios, fashion designers, photographers, sound engineers from radio stations and recording studios, set designers from Broadway and Hollywood, industrial designers, even a guy who'd worked on exhibits at the 1939 World's Fair. One soldier later said it felt like walking onto a movie set, not a military base. The commanding officer was Colonel Harry Reeder, and he stood in front of this bizarre collection of creative professionals turned soldiers and told them something that sounded completely insane. Their job was going to be pretending to be other army units. They were going to create fake armies, make the enemy think there were thousands of soldiers and hundreds of tanks in places where there were actually just a handful of guys with some equipment. But here's the thing that made it interesting. They weren't just going to use camouflage or hide in the woods. They were going to actively deceive the enemy using every trick in the book. Visual deception, audio deception, radio deception, even atmospheric deception. They were going to become a ghost army. The unit was officially designated as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, but that boring name hid what was probably the most unusual collection of soldiers ever assembled in the US Army. Let me tell you about some of these guys because their backgrounds were wild. Bill Blass. Yeah, that Bill Blass. The fashion designer who'd later become one of the most famous names in American fashion. In 1944, he was a 21-year-old private in the Ghost Army. Ellsworth Kelly, the abstract painter whose works would later sell for millions of dollars and hang in museums around the world. He was there painting fake unit insignias on trucks. Art Kane, the photographer who'd later take one of the most famous jazz photographs of all time. He was documenting the Ghost Army's operations. There was also a guy named Harold Lehner who'd been a sound engineer at a major radio network. His job was going to be making recordings that sounded like entire tank divisions moving across the countryside. Another soldier, Victor Dowd, had been an industrial designer. His specialty was going to be figuring out how to make inflatable rubber tanks look real enough to fool German reconnaissance planes from thousands of feet up. These weren't typical soldiers. Most of them had been drafted, sure, but they'd been specifically selected because of their creative backgrounds. The army had looked at their draft records and thought, hey, this guy worked in advertising doing visual effects. We need him for something. The whole unit was only about 1,100 men. For context, a typical US Army division had about 15,000 soldiers, so the Ghost Army was tiny compared to regular combat units. But size wasn't the point. The point was specialization. The unit was divided into 4 main sections, each with a specific job in the deception operations. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers were in charge of visual deception. These were the guys who'd handle the inflatable equipment and make everything look real from the air and from a distance. The 3132nd Signal Service Company handled sonic deception. They'd use massive speakers to blast pre-recorded sounds of tank movements, truck convoys, and construction equipment to convince German scouts they were hearing a huge Allied force. The Signal Company Special also did radio deception. They'd send fake radio messages using the codes and call signs of real Allied units to make German radio interceptors think entire divisions were in completely different places. And then there was the combat engineer platoon, who'd handle security and actually defend the unit if things went south. Because here's the thing people forget. These deception operations happened close to the front lines, real close, sometimes within artillery range of German positions. The training they went through at Camp Forest was unlike anything in the Army's standard training manual because, well, there was no standard training manual for this stuff. They learned how to inflate the rubber tanks and vehicles quickly in the dark. They practiced setting up entire fake command posts with tents, vehicles, and communication equipment in just a few hours. They studied how shadows fell at different times of day so they could position inflatable equipment to look real in reconnaissance photos. The audio guys recorded hundreds of hours of real tank movements, artillery fire, and construction sounds. Then they figured out how to play those recordings through speakers loud enough that German scouts a mile away would think they were hearing the real thing. The radio operators learned to mimic the communication patterns of different Allied units. Every division had its own way of formatting messages, its own slang, its own timing for radio checks. The Ghost Army guys had to learn all of that, so their fake radio traffic would sound authentic. But here's what made the training really challenging. They had to learn all of this while keeping the entire operation secret. Even within the Ghost Army, most soldiers didn't know the full scope of what they were training for. The inflatable tank crews didn't necessarily know what the radio guys were doing. The sound engineers didn't always know how the visual deception was being set up. It was compartmentalized for security, because if even one of these guys got captured by the Germans and talked, the whole concept would be blown. Every operation they'd run from that point forward would be useless, because the Germans would know to look for the tricks. By May 1944, the unit was considered ready. They packed up their inflatable tanks, their sound trucks, their radio equipment, and all their other gear, and they shipped out to England. The Allied invasion of France was coming in a few weeks, and the Ghost Army was about to be thrown into their first real operation, one that would directly affect whether D-Day succeeded or failed. But nobody in the unit knew that yet. They just knew they were heading to Europe, and their training was over. The real test was about to begin. Okay, so let's talk about the equipment these guys used, because this is where things get really interesting. The centerpiece of the Ghost Army's visual deception was inflatable equipment. And when I say inflatable, I mean like balloon animals. Except instead of making balloon dogs at a kid's birthday party, these guys were making balloon Sherman tanks that weighed 95 pounds instead of 30 tons. The inflatable tanks were made from rubberized canvas, the same kind of material you'd use for a raft or a weather balloon, but shaped and painted to look exactly like real tanks from a distance. Here's how absurd this was. A real M4 Sherman tank weighed about 66,000 pounds. The inflatable version weighed 95 pounds and could be inflated by 2 guys using a hand pump in about 15 minutes. 4 guys could carry one of these things rolled up in a duffel bag. Then they'd find a spot, unroll it, pump it up, stake it down so the wind wouldn't blow it away, and boom! From the air, it looked exactly like a 30-ton tank. They had inflatable artillery pieces too, fake howitzers that looked perfect from overhead reconnaissance but would have blown away in a strong wind if they hadn't tied them down. They had inflatable trucks, half-tracks, even inflatable airplanes that they'd set up on fake airfields. The guys who built these things had really thought about the details. The inflatable tanks had fake track marks built into them that left realistic-looking impressions in the dirt when you dragged them across the ground. The fake artillery pieces had realistic shadow patterns painted on them so they'd look three-dimensional in reconnaissance photos. They even had fake unit markings that they'd paint on the sides. If they were pretending to be the 2nd Armoured Division, they'd paint the 2nd Armoured Division's insignia on their rubber tanks. If they were supposed to be the 5th Infantry Division, they'd paint those markings instead. But the inflatable equipment was just part of it. The visual deception was way more complex than just pumping up fake tanks and calling it a day. They had to create an entire fake military base that would pass inspection from German reconnaissance planes flying at 20,000 feet taking photographs. That meant more than just equipment. It meant fake activity. They'd set up tents in the right patterns that matched how real units would camp. They'd park their few real vehicles in spots where they'd create the right kinds of tire tracks. They'd hang laundry on lines between tents because that's what soldiers at a real base would do. They'd even set up fake mess halls with smoke coming from the chimneys at meal times, because German photo analysts knew that if there were 2,000 soldiers at a base, there'd be 3 meals a day with cooking fires or generator-powered kitchen equipment producing smoke and heat signatures. One of the most genius tricks they used was camouflage netting, but not the way you'd think. Normal units used camouflage netting to hide their equipment. The Ghost Army used camouflage netting to reveal their fake equipment. They drape camo netting over their inflatable tanks in a way that made it obvious something was underneath. German reconnaissance analysts would see the poorly concealed shapes under the netting and think, those Americans think they're being sneaky, but we can totally see those tanks. The Germans would count the barely hidden tanks, report back to command, and German forces would adjust their positions based on where they thought the American armor was massing. Meanwhile, the real American tanks were somewhere else entirely, totally undetected, because the Germans were focused on the decoys. But the visual deception alone wouldn't work. Here's why. German scouts on the ground would eventually get close enough to notice something was off. An inflatable tank doesn't sound like a real tank. It doesn't produce engine noise. It doesn't have exhaust. It doesn't shake the ground when it moves. So the Ghost Army needed to add layers to make the deception work at multiple levels. That's where the sound trucks came in. The 31 Montreal Second Signal Service Company's specialty was sonic deception, and what they did with it was borderline insane. They'd spent months back in the States recording actual tank units, not just the sound of one tank idling. They recorded entire tank battalions moving in formation, making turns, accelerating, decelerating, all of it. They recorded the sound of trucks in convoy. Different truck types had different engine sounds, so they recorded Jeeps, GMC trucks, half-tracks, all of them. They recorded soldiers shouting orders, tools clanking, construction equipment operating, the whole soundscape of a military unit preparing for combat. Then they figured out how to amplify these recordings loud enough that German scouts a mile away would hear them and think they were listening to the real thing. The speakers they used were massive. Each sound truck had speakers that could project sound up to 15 miles away under the right atmospheric conditions. These weren't like the speakers in your car. These were industrial-grade speaker systems that could make the ground vibrate from half a mile away. On a quiet night, German scouts across the front lines could hear what sounded like dozens of tanks moving into position, engines revving, commanders shouting orders, all of it clear enough that they could identify it as American equipment based on the engine sounds. But here's the clever part. The Ghost Army guys didn't just play recordings at random. They choreographed them. If they were simulating a tank unit moving from point A to point B, they'd start the recording at point A. Then, after the appropriate amount of time had passed, the time it would actually take real tanks to make that journey, they'd start playing the recording from speakers at point B. To a German scout tracking the sounds through the night, it legitimately sounded like a tank unit had just moved several miles. They'd hear the tanks at the first position, then silence, then the tanks at the second position. Just like you'd expect, the audio guys would even mix in appropriate environmental sounds. If it was raining, real tanks would sound different than on a dry night, so they had different versions of their recordings for different weather conditions. They had recordings of tank units preparing for an attack, the sounds of crews performing maintenance, loading ammunition, all the distinct noises that happened before a unit went into combat. And here's what made it extra convincing. They'd sync the audio deception with the visual deception. If German reconnaissance planes photographed what looked like a tank battalion during the day, then at night, German scouts would hear what sounded like that same tank battalion moving around, performing maintenance, getting ready for action. The multi-sensory deception made it way more convincing. It's one thing to see fake tanks. It's another thing to hear them too. But there was still a third layer of deception that made the whole thing work. Because the Germans weren't just using scouts and reconnaissance planes, they were also intercepting Allied radio communications. The signal company special handled radio deception, and this might have been the most technically difficult part of the entire operation. German intelligence was really good at radio interception. They had listening posts all along the front lines, with operators who spoke fluent English monitoring Allied radio frequencies 24 hours a day. They weren't just listening for intelligence about attack plans, they were mapping out the entire Allied order of battle just by analysing radio traffic patterns. Every Allied division had a different radio signature, different units used different frequencies, different call signs, different codes, different encryption methods, different message formats. Even the timing of their radio checks was distinctive. If you monitored a radio network long enough, you could figure out which unit was using it just by the patterns, even if you couldn't break their codes. The Germans had gotten really good at this. So good that they could often identify when Allied units were moving just by tracking which radio networks suddenly went silent in one area and became active in another area. The Ghost Army's radio operators had to learn to mimic all of this. If they were pretending to be the 2nd Armored Division, they had to use that division's actual call signs, its message formats, its radio check timing, everything. They had to sound like that division on the air. But here's the extra tricky part. They had to do this while the real 2nd Armored Division was also on the air somewhere else. The way they pulled this off was through careful coordination with actual Allied units. The real 2nd Armored would maintain radio silence while moving to a new location. During that silence, the Ghost Army would start broadcasting fake traffic using the 2nd Armored's call signs and codes in a completely different area. German radio interceptors would track the radio signals, plot them on their maps, and conclude that the 2nd Armored Division was in the fake location where the Ghost Army was broadcasting from. Meanwhile, the real 2nd Armored would move into position somewhere else, maintaining total radio silence until they were ready to attack. The Ghost Army radio guys got so good at this that they could simulate entire divisional command nets. They'd have multiple operators broadcasting fake traffic that sounded like a whole network of command posts, artillery units, supply units, all coordinating with each other. They'd send fake supply requests. We need 5,000 gallons of fuel delivered to these coordinates. German intelligence would intercept that and think, okay, that unit is planning to move, they're requesting fuel. That means they're preparing for an operation. They'd send fake weather requests. Request forecast for the following map coordinates. The Germans would see those coordinates and conclude that's where the Allies were planning to operate. They'd send fake casualty reports, fake equipment status reports, fake logistics requests, all of it designed to paint a picture of a real military unit preparing for real operations in a fake location. The radio operators would even mimic the personal communication styles of real commanders. They studied how different Allied officers formatted their messages, what kind of language they used, even their patterns of emphasis. Then they'd imitate those patterns in their fake traffic. German intelligence officers analyzing the radio intercepts would see message formats and communication patterns that matched known Allied units, and they'd conclude the traffic was legitimate. The beauty of the radio deception was that it worked even if the Germans never broke the codes. The patterns alone told them what they thought they needed to know. And all of this, the inflatable tanks, the sound trucks, the radio deception, had to work together in perfect coordination. If the visual deception said there was a tank battalion in location A, but the radio traffic was coming from location B, the Germans would know something was wrong. Everything had to sync up. The fake radio traffic had to match the location of the fake visual equipment. The sound trucks had to be close enough to the inflatable tanks that German scouts would connect the sounds to the visual targets. The timing of everything had to align so the deception told one consistent story. It was like directing a play, except the audience was actively trying to figure out it was fake, and if they succeeded, people would die. Now, all of this training and equipment and planning was great in theory, but the Ghost Army hadn't actually pulled off a real operation yet. They'd practiced in Tennessee, they'd refined their techniques in England, but they hadn't fooled an actual enemy in actual combat conditions. That was about to change, because D-Day was coming and the Ghost Army was about to play a role in the biggest deception operation of World War II. June 1944. The Allied invasion of Normandy was scheduled for early June, but there was a massive problem that kept Eisenhower and the Allied command up at night. The Germans had 60 divisions in France. The Allies were landing with about 8 divisions on D-Day, with more coming in the following days and weeks. If the Germans figured out where the invasion was happening and concentrated their forces there, the invasion could fail. The German panzer divisions were the biggest threat. If those tank units reached the beaches while the Allies were still unloading troops and equipment, they could push the invasion force back into the sea. So the Allies needed the Germans to think the invasion was coming somewhere else, or better yet, make the Germans think multiple invasions were coming in multiple places, so they'd spread their forces out, trying to defend everywhere. That's where Operation Fortitude came in. It was the code name for the massive deception plan designed to confuse German intelligence about when and where the invasion would happen. The Ghost Army was a key part of Fortitude South, the portion of the deception that was supposed to convince the Germans the main invasion would hit Pas-de-Calais instead of Normandy. Pas-de-Calais made sense as an invasion target. It was the shortest distance between England and France. The Germans knew this. They'd heavily fortified Pas-de-Calais because it was the most obvious place to invade. The Allied plan was brilliant, make the Germans think they were right. Starting in April 1944, the Ghost Army set up operations in southeast England, directly across from Pas-de-Calais. They created the appearance of a massive army group preparing to invade. They set up fake base camps with inflatable vehicles and equipment. They had real soldiers move around these fake bases to create activity that German reconnaissance planes would photograph. They broadcast fake radio traffic indicating huge numbers of troops concentrating in that area. But the Ghost Army alone couldn't pull off a deception this big. They were part of a larger operation that included real units, double agents, and even fake commanders. The Allies created an entirely fictional army called the 1st United States Army Group, supposedly commanded by General George Patton. They put out press releases about Patton taking command. They had him make public appearances in southeast England. German intelligence knew Patton was one of the Allies' best generals, so if he was in southeast England, that's probably where the invasion was coming from. Meanwhile, the Ghost Army created the physical evidence that Patton's fictional army group actually existed. They set up fake camps near Dover and other towns in southeast England. German reconnaissance planes flying over would photograph what looked like massive preparations for an invasion. Hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, troop concentrations, supply depots, all of it. Except most of it was inflatable or completely fake. The Ghost Army guys would spend all night setting up their inflatable equipment. By dawn, when German reconnaissance planes made their morning runs, they'd photograph what looked like a new tank battalion that had moved in overnight. The sound trucks would run at night, creating the noise of tank movements and construction activity. German intelligence officers analyzing sound detection data would conclude there was major construction and preparation happening in those areas. The radio operators would broadcast constant fake traffic using call signs of real Allied units. German radio interceptors would track the signals, plot them on their maps, and report massive force concentrations in southeast England. Everything pointed to Pas-de-Calais as the invasion target. The deception worked better than anyone expected. On June 6, 1944, when the Allies actually landed at Normandy, the German High Command refused to commit their reserves. They thought Normandy was a diversion. They believed the real invasion, the big one, was still coming at Pas-de-Calais. German intelligence kept reporting radio intercepts and reconnaissance data showing Patton's army group was still in southeast England, apparently preparing for the real invasion. The Germans kept several panzer divisions near Pas-de-Calais for weeks after D-Day, waiting for an invasion that was never coming. Those panzer divisions could have been at Normandy. They could have counterattacked the beaches while the Allies were still establishing their foothold. Instead, they sat 150 miles away, waiting for Ghost Army inflatable tanks that didn't exist. Historians estimate this deception saved thousands of Allied lives in the critical first days of the invasion, maybe tens of thousands, because those German panzer divisions never made it to Normandy until it was too late to matter. But here's the thing. The Ghost Army's work wasn't done. Operation Fortitude was a success, but now they had to transition from strategic deception to tactical deception. They had to go to France. The Ghost Army landed in France in mid-June 1944, about a week after D-Day. This was different from their work in England. In England, they'd been safely behind the lines, creating a fake army that German reconnaissance planes could photograph from a distance. In France, they were going to be near, sometimes very near, actual German positions. German artillery could reach them. German patrols could stumble onto them. If the Germans figured out what they were doing, they'd become priority targets because destroying the deception unit would expose the trick. Their first operation in France was called Operation Elephant. It happened in mid-July 1944, and it was designed to make the Germans think the Allies were preparing for a major attack near the town of Saint-Lô when the real attack was coming somewhere else. The Ghost Army set up their operation, just a few miles behind the front lines. They could hear German artillery firing. They could see smoke from battle on the horizon. They inflated their rubber tanks and positioned them to look like a real armored unit was staging for an assault. They set up fake command posts. They ran their sound trucks at night, blasting recordings of tank movements and construction equipment. The radio operators broadcast traffic indicating the 2nd Armored Division was in that area preparing for an offensive. Meanwhile, the real 2nd Armored Division was moving into position 20 miles away for the actual attack. German reconnaissance spotted the Ghost Army's fake tanks. German radio interceptors picked up the fake traffic. German scouts reported hearing tank movements in the area. German commanders looked at all this intelligence and concluded the Americans were preparing to attack at St. Lo. They reinforced that section of their line. They moved artillery into range. They prepared for an assault. When the real Allied attack came 20 miles away, the Germans were caught out of position. Their reinforcements were in the wrong place. Their artillery was ranged in on the wrong coordinates. Operation Elephant was a success. The Ghost Army had pulled off their first tactical deception in an active combat zone, but they'd also learned something important. This work was dangerous as hell. During the operation, German artillery had fired ranging shots into the area where the Ghost Army was set up. One shell had landed close enough to one of the inflatable tanks that the shrapnel had punctured it, and it had slowly deflated over the course of the night. The crew had to re-inflate it before dawn when the German reconnaissance planes made their morning run. Another problem: local French civilians had seen the Americans setting up their fake equipment. The Ghost Army guys had to be really careful about operational security, because if word got back to the Germans through civilian sources that the American tanks were fake, the whole operation would blow up. They started posting guards around their fake installations with orders to prevent anyone from getting close enough to figure out the equipment was inflatable. From a distance, with armed guards patrolling around them, the rubber tanks looked even more legitimate. Over the next few months, the Ghost Army ran operation after operation as the Allies pushed across France. Operation Brittany in August 1944. They made the Germans think an entire armoured division was operating in the Brittany Peninsula when it was actually just the Ghost Army with their inflatable tanks and sound trucks. Operation Brest in September 1944. They simulated the US 6th Armoured Division to cover the movements of the actual 6th Armoured during the siege of Brest. Each operation refined their techniques. They got faster at setting up. They got better at coordinating all three types of deception. They learned which tricks worked best in different terrain and weather conditions. But they were about to face their biggest challenge yet, an operation that would require them to simulate two entire divisions simultaneously while being within direct observation range of German positions. This was Operation Viersen, and it was going to be the Ghost Army's masterpiece of deception. March 1945. The war in Europe was almost over, but the fighting was still brutal. The Allies were pushing into Germany itself, and the Germans were defending every inch of their homeland with everything they had left. The US 9th Army was preparing to cross the Rhine River near the town of Viersen. The Rhine was the last major natural barrier before the industrial heart of Germany. If the Allies could get across in force, German resistance would collapse. But crossing a river under fire is one of the most difficult military operations there is. Soldiers are packed into boats, totally exposed. The enemy is on high ground on the opposite bank, shooting down at you. It's a nightmare. The Allied plan was to create diversions up and down the Rhine to spread out German defences. If the Germans had to defend multiple potential crossing points, they couldn't concentrate their forces at the actual crossing point. That's where the Ghost Army came in. Their job: make the Germans think the Americans were preparing to cross the Rhine at two completely different locations, miles away from where the real crossing would happen. This was the most complex operation they'd attempted. They had to simulate not just one division, but two divisions simultaneously, in two different locations, both within visual range of German observation posts on the opposite side of the Rhine. The first location was near Krefeld, the second was near Düsseldorf. The real crossing would happen between them, near Viersen. The Ghost Army split into two teams and got to work. At Krefeld, they set up what looked like a staging area for a river crossing. They positioned inflatable tanks and vehicles in assembly areas. They set up what appeared to be boat storage facilities where you'd keep the equipment for a river crossing operation. They even created fake construction activity. making it look like engineers were building river crossing sites. At Dusseldorf, they did the same thing at a different location. The Germans could literally see all of this from their side of the river. German observers with binoculars and spotting scopes could watch the Americans preparing for the river crossing, except they were watching inflatable equipment being moved around by a few dozen Ghost Army soldiers, not real assault preparations by thousands of combat troops. At night, the sound trucks ran constantly. The Germans could hear what sounded like massive construction projects, heavy equipment moving, tanks being staged, all the noise of a major military operation. The radio operators broadcast fake traffic indicating that the 30th Infantry Division was at Krefeld and the E-79th Infantry Division was at Dusseldorf, both preparing for river crossings. German intelligence intercepted all of this. They tracked the radio signals. They analyzed the reconnaissance photos. They compiled reports from their observers on the opposite side of the river who were literally watching the American preparations through binoculars. All of it pointed to river crossings at Krefeld and Dusseldorf. German commanders looked at this intelligence and made their decision. They reinforced those two locations. They moved artillery to cover those crossing points. They positioned reserves behind those sections of the Rhine. On March the 23rd, 1945, the US Ninth Army crossed the Rhine at Wiesen, between the two fake crossing sites. The German defenses were in the wrong place. Their artillery was ranged in on the wrong coordinates. Their reserves were positioned to counter attacks that weren't coming. The Americans got across the Rhine with significantly lighter casualties than expected. The bridgehead was established quickly. German counterattacks were confused and disorganized because they'd been expecting the crossings to happen in completely different locations. Operation Wiesen was a complete success. It was probably the Ghost Army's most sophisticated deception of the entire war, and it demonstrated something important. Tactical deception could work even when the enemy could directly observe your positions. The Germans had literally been watching the Ghost Army's fake preparations with binoculars, and they still fell for it. Why? Because every piece of intelligence they gathered, visual observation, radio intercepts, sound detection, even reports from their own scouts, all told the same consistent story. The multi-layered deception was so complete that the Germans had no reason to doubt what they were seeing and hearing. But there's something else about Operation Wiesen that's worth noting. By this point in the war, the Ghost Army had run more than 20 major deception operations. The Germans had never caught on to the trick. Think about that for a second. The Ghost Army had been operating for almost a year, running operations up and down the front lines, and German intelligence had never figured out that the Americans had a dedicated deception unit using fake equipment. Either the Ghost Army was incredibly good at operational security, or the Germans couldn't accept that what they were seeing wasn't real, or both. But the war in Europe was almost over. Germany surrendered in May 1945. The Ghost Army's work was done, except it wasn't really done, because now came the hard part, keeping it secret. When the war ended, the Ghost Army soldiers expected to go home and tell their families about the crazy stuff they'd done. They'd been part of one of the most successful deception operations in military history. They'd literally tricked the German army with rubber tanks and sound effects. That's a hell of a story to tell at dinner parties. But they were ordered not to talk about it, any of it. The entire Ghost Army operation was classified top secret. The men were told that discussing their wartime service could result in prosecution under the Espionage Act. Why the secrecy? The US military wanted to keep using these deception tactics. The Cold War was starting, and if potential adversaries knew about the inflatable tanks and sonic deception and radio spoofing techniques, those tactics would become worthless. So the Ghost Army guys went home and didn't tell anyone what they'd actually done during the war. Family members would ask, "So what did you do in the war?" and they'd give vague answers about special operations or training exercises, or just change the subject. Bill Blass, the fashion designer, never talked about his Ghost Army service for decades. Ellsworth Kelly, the famous artist, didn't discuss it publicly. None of them did. For 40 years, one of the most successful military units of World War II was completely unknown to the public. The men got older. They had careers, families, normal lives, but they couldn't share this huge part of their life experience because it was still classified. Some of them stayed in touch with their old Ghost Army buddies, but even among themselves they were careful about discussing operational details because they never knew when the classification might be lifted. It wasn't until 1996, more than 50 years after the war ended, that the Ghost Army's operations were finally declassified. By then, a lot of the original Ghost Army soldiers had died. They'd gone their whole lives unable to talk about what they'd done. But once the declassification happened, the remaining veterans started coming forward. They did interviews, they wrote memoirs, they donated their documents and photographs to museums and archives, and slowly the story of the Ghost Army started to become public. Historians started analyzing the operations and realized just how effective they'd been. Military analysts started studying the tactics and incorporating lessons from the Ghost Army's operations into modern deception doctrine. In 2013, Congress finally awarded the Ghost Army soldiers the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors the US government can give. By that point, only a handful of the original 1,100 men were still alive to receive it. A documentary film about the Ghost Army came out in 2013, featuring interviews with surviving veterans. That's when a lot of younger people first learned about this unit's existence. But even after the declassification, some details remain murky. Some of the Ghost Army's operations are still partially classified. Some documents were destroyed or lost. Some techniques they used have never been fully explained in public sources. What we do know is this: the Ghost Army ran at least 21 major deception operations during their time in Europe. They're credited with saving between 15,000 and 30,000 Allied lives by drawing German forces away from real Allied positions. They never fired a shot in combat. They never directly engaged the enemy. But they were arguably more effective at saving Allied lives than units 10 times their size that were doing traditional combat operations. So here's the question: why did this work so well? The Ghost Army was using fake equipment that would have been obvious to anyone who got close to it. Inflatable tanks that weighed 95 pounds, sound recordings played through speakers, radio messages from units that weren't actually there. How did the Germans never figure it out? There are a few reasons, and they all relate to human psychology and how military intelligence works. First, confirmation bias. The Germans expected to see American military units preparing for operations. When they saw what looked like American military units, their brains processed that information as confirmation of what they already expected to see. They weren't looking for deception because they had no reason to suspect deception at that scale was even possible. Second, the intelligence matched across multiple sources. When visual reconnaissance showed tanks, audio reconnaissance heard tanks, and radio reconnaissance intercepted tank unit communications, all pointing to the same location, why would you doubt it? The multi-layered approach made the deception incredibly convincing because it was consistent across every intelligence gathering method the Germans had. Third, the Germans had actually seen similar deception attempts before, but at a much smaller scale. Individual units would sometimes use dummy tanks made from wood or canvas to try to confuse reconnaissance. But those were obvious fakes if you looked closely, and they were used for local camouflage, not large-scale strategic deception. The Germans didn't conceive that the Americans would dedicate an entire specialized unit to deception operations at this scale, with this level of sophistication. Fourth, operational security. The Ghost Army was really careful about keeping their methods secret. They ran their operations at night when possible. They posted guards around their inflatable equipment. They didn't allow unauthorized personnel anywhere near their operations. And critically, they moved frequently. They'd run an operation in one area, then pack up and move somewhere else before German forces could get close enough to physically inspect what they'd set up. Fifth, the sheer audacity of it. Sometimes the best place to hide something is in plain sight, because nobody expects you to be that bold. The Ghost Army would set up their fake installations just a few miles behind the front lines, sometimes within artillery range of German positions. German intelligence officers looking at reconnaissance reports might think there's no way the Americans would put real tank units that close to our lines. That's too risky. But the Germans also knew that Americans sometimes did tactically questionable things. So they saw the tanks, assumed they were real but poorly positioned, and adjusted their own tactics accordingly. There's also a practical military reason it worked. German intelligence was operating under enormous pressure by 1944 and 1945. They were fighting on multiple fronts. They were being pushed back. They were desperately trying to figure out where the next Allied attack would come from, so they could position their dwindling forces effectively. In that environment, intelligence officers didn't have time to doubt every piece of information they received. They had to make quick decisions based on the best available intelligence. And the intelligence they were getting about Allied positions was usually accurate because the Allies weren't normally using deception at this scale. So when the Ghost Army operations showed up in intelligence reports, they looked like every other accurate intelligence report German analysts had been seeing. There was no red flag that said, "This one's fake." The Ghost Army exploited a fundamental problem in military intelligence. You can only analyze the information you receive. If someone feeds you consistent, multi-source false information that matches your expectations and your existing knowledge of enemy capabilities, it's really hard to identify it as false. Modern military doctrine has learned from this. Every major military now has deception units and assumes that adversaries will use deception operations. Intelligence analysts are trained to look for inconsistencies that might indicate deception. But in 1944, this was new. The Germans weren't specifically looking for it, and by the time they might have started to suspect something was off, the war was almost over. The Ghost Army's techniques seem almost quaint now. Inflatable tanks and recorded sounds feel like something from a cartoon, not serious military operations. But the principles behind what they did are still being used today. Modern military deception is obviously more sophisticated. Instead of inflatable tanks, militaries use radar reflectors that make one vehicle look like 100 vehicles on enemy radar. Instead of sound trucks, they use electronic warfare to spoof communications and sensor systems. Instead of fake radio traffic, they use cyber operations to plant false information in enemy networks. But it's all the same concept. Make the enemy think you're doing something you're not doing, so they waste resources defending against attacks that aren't coming while you hit them where they're weak. The US military still has dedicated deception units. They're not using rubber tanks anymore, but they're applying the same multi-layered approach the Ghost Army pioneered. Visual deception, electronic deception, cyber deception, all coordinated to tell one consistent false story to the enemy. The Ghost Army proved that in warfare, creativity can be just as valuable as firepower. That a small group of people with unusual skills can have strategic impact way beyond what their numbers would suggest. And they proved something else. Sometimes the most effective way to save lives isn't to be better at fighting, it's to not fight at all. To make the enemy fight shadows while your real forces hit them where they're not looking. 15,000 to 30,000 Allied soldiers lived through World War II who might not have if the Ghost Army hadn't been drawing German forces away from real Allied positions. That's 15,000 to 30,000 people who got to go home, have families, live their lives because a bunch of artists and sound engineers and radio operators were really good at lying to the German army. That's not a small thing. The Ghost Army story also raises interesting questions about military history and how we remember wars. For 40 years, this unit didn't exist in the public consciousness of World War II. Historians writing about D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge and the Rhine crossings didn't know about the Ghost Army's role in those operations because it was classified. How much of military history is still classified? What other units or operations don't we know about because they're still secret? What will we learn in another 50 years when today's classified operations get declassified? The Ghost Army guys themselves have said they're just glad people finally know what they did. A lot of them spent decades feeling like they couldn't fully process their own wartime experiences because they couldn't talk about it. The declassification and the recognition they received later in life gave them a chance to finally discuss this huge part of their lives. Some of them have said they wish it had been declassified sooner, while more of their fellow Ghost Army soldiers were still alive to see their work recognized. But better late than never. The last surviving member of the Ghost Army died recently. With his death, there are no more living witnesses to these operations. Everything we know now comes from documents, photographs, and the interviews done with veterans before they passed away. But their legacy lives on in how modern militaries think about deception operations, in the museums and memorials dedicated to their service, in the documentaries and books that tell their story, and in the fact that thousands of soldiers who would have died in 1944 and 1945 lived instead, all because some artists made really convincing balloon animals. So that's the story of the Ghost Army, 1,000 guys with rubber tanks and boomboxes who saved tens of thousands of lives by being really, really good at lying. They proved that in war, creativity matters. That thinking differently can save more lives than shooting straighter, that sometimes the best weapon isn't a weapon at all. It's a good idea and the skill to execute it. The next time someone tells you that art and creativity don't have practical value, maybe tell them about the Ghost Army, about how fashion designers and sound engineers and painters helped win World War II without firing a shot. If you found this interesting, subscribe for more history that challenges what you think you know.